we became immediately darling. ABC, local news started coming to us, and there was Portrait of a Coffee Connoisseur, a 10-minute show on the 6 o'clock
Wow.
news, when I knew nothing about coffee at all, right? But there it was. I mean, we were the celebration. And then I think it was July 17th, the Black Frost in Brazil hit. Okay.
Is that in
And
75?
1975. So here
Yeah.
we are, alive and thriving like crazy. And that hits. And now, because things were not yet interneted and so on, it's a
Right.
slower wave, right, that's coming on. And for the next 2 years, the price of coffee just rises and rises and rises up to
Wow.
about $3.35 a pound. That's the C contract,
Right.
which is what we just surpassed for the first time in 50 years.
If the content we bring you on the podcast has helped you with your business or your career and you're looking for a way to financially support the independent production of this podcast, you can do that for as little as a few dollars a month by backing us on Patreon or becoming a paid subscriber on our YouTube channel. Another way to support us and continue your learning is to purchase one of our on-demand workshops available on our website, mapitforward.coffee/workshops. Check the show notes for links, and as always, thanks for the support. Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is episode 3 of a wonderful 5-part series with the fantastic George Howell. Every year I'm excited for this series because the theme every year is the coffee industry according to George Howell. This is the 2025 edition. We've talked about quality, we've talked about the pricing of green coffee, and in this episode, the third in this 5-part series, we are talking about whether we should be passing on the price increases to our consumers. So we're talking about roasted coffee here. George, you guys have always valued buying not just expensive coffees, but quality coffee. You pay for a premium coffee. And so your customers are accustomed to paying not cheap prices for coffee.
Yes.
How are you guys faring in this moment with regards to these price increases?
Well, what's interesting is the price increases are only happening as we speak.
Right, we're in it.
Right. And so I just finished what I bought last year because we freeze the coffee.
Yes.
So my Costa Ricans, my Guatemalans, all these coffees have been kept frozen for the year, and I've just run out, and we're just beginning the coffees that I have paid vastly more money for. Right? So we are now, yes, looking at raising prices. And I guess it depends. One, it depends on the size of your company and how deep your pockets are. If you're a small cafe, maybe you're a roastery cafe or just a cafe, right? You have to pass on the coffee because otherwise you're going under. You don't have pockets to outlast the wave, the height of the wave, right? This happened to me. That's kind of interesting with Coffee Connection in 1975. I opened up in April of 1975, and here I am happily roasting coffee, and Boston goes nuts. Despite having been told by everybody in the business that I'd be bankrupt in a matter of months, the opposite happened. We became immediately darling. ABC, local news started coming to us, and there was Portrait of a Coffee Connoisseur, a 10-minute show on the 6 o'clock news, when I knew nothing about coffee at all, right? But there it was. I mean, we were the celebration. And then I think it was July 17th, the Black Frost in Brazil hit. Okay.
Is that in 75?
1975. So here we are, alive and thriving like crazy. And that hits. And now, because things were not yet interneted and so on, it's a slower wave, right, that's coming on. And for the next 2 years, the price of coffee just rises and rises and rises up to about $3.35 a pound. That's the C contract,
Right.
which is what we just surpassed for the first time in 50 years back in January, right?
Right.
That was
Way
the
surpassed it.
point. Only 335 in today's terms was $14, not three.
Yep.
If you look at it in today's numbers. And so I had no choice but to raise prices like crazy because that was everything. There was no way to pay for that. So we kept rising prices. And I remember that I have a photograph of one of the barrels that I was scooping coffee from, Hawaiian Kona, $2.99 a pound. Retail.
That's unheard of.
Yeah. All of that, $2.99. I blew
Folks,
my mind.
for context, the shittiest of shitty Kona coffee today, you are paying $19 green per pound.
That's cool. Exactly.
The shittiest of shitty coffee.
This was the beginning, right? So as the prices go up, I'm going from $2.99 for the most expensive coffee, and we hit about $5 to $6 a pound, and that's when the bottom fell out. Right. This is months later, maybe a year later, right? As the C price keeps rising and rising over these 2 years, and the bottom falls out, and retail slows down to like a fraction of what it was. The cafe part is what keeps us sustained, right?
Right.
Because it's a smaller piece, right? And you're able to sell for higher prices the drink. We barely make it. Yeah.
Can I just ask, when you did start increasing your prices and passing them on back then in 75 and 76,
right away,
how did your customers respond to that? And first of all, how did you communicate that to your customers back then? And how did they respond to those price increases?
They responded very well up until around $5 or $6.
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a time that was so different, okay?
Yeah.
I mean, when I opened up in 1975 and we were going through this wave of humanity coming into our cafes, we were overwhelmed. I didn't have enough people working behind. I had customers jumping behind the bar and doing the dishes.
Wow.
Who refused to be paid, right? I'd say, God, I owe you so much. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. You saved our ass. Let me pay you. No, I won't take it. We had people who were teaching it at Harvard University. One guy who was coming there doing that, right? I mean, it was a different world.
Yeah.
Very different world. And so
how amazing to be a part of that time, though.
It was amazing. It truly was. Thank God I was at that time. And so I don't remember getting many complaints. I just remember slowly, like a rainstorm, slowly ending and disappearing. Less and less people coming.
Really? So there was a consequence to it, that they just didn't buy as much coffee.
We went from the $1 to $2 a pound thing to $5, $6. So that's a major, that's gigantic increase.
Yeah.
It started to go, right? And again, it was the bar that we had. Because unlike Pete's and the original Starbucks and so on, I had a cafe day one, right? Day one, right away. We were doing French press, so I could, if I had 15 different coffees available to you, I could make any coffee on the spot, besides offering the urn, which was immediate and less expensive, right? Brew. So we were going, I think it was 25 cents for a cup of coffee, and then we went to 50 cents, right?
Wow.
And then and so on. And that, it became more and more of a trickle, but the losses were such that we were able to make it to the finish line. The other thing
Right.
that happened was that sometime around 1978, several years into it, people started coming back, and it was sort of like a slow wave of increases because people were saying, if I have to, they literally, and any number were saying to me, I'm paying a lot of money for this crap that I can't stand drinking. So if I'm going to spend money, at least I'm going to buy something that I enjoy.
Yeah. Right.
So to my mind, from my point of view, having been born in 75, specialty was born at that moment because
Right.
the price was no longer connected to the commodity. We were sort of liberated in a way.
I guess
Despite
that was,
that, we never would have pushed for that had it not been for that,
and these
right?
events have to happen in order for there to be those kinds of shifts in perspective from a consumer perspective, right? Otherwise, the trajectory the prices of something continues to stay where it is. Something needs to cause
Yes,
inflation in
that's
products. Otherwise, consumers are
you
not
nailed
going
it.
to.
It's exactly right. So now we have such a moment, without a doubt. One of my concerns was that all
Mhm.
the specialty coffee that I was buying
Mhm.
for my cafes, right, and my mail order, my direct to consumer sales, those were
Yeah.
really, we had the bulk ones that we also sold at the lower price, but those are the babies I love, right? And
Right.
um, those prices, for the most part, with a few exceptions like Panama and whatever, were also stuck. They were stuck at
Okay.
a higher level, and they
Mm.
seemed to be independent of the sea. But once it was sort of like you're no longer in this little corral, but it's a bigger corral, but it's a corral.
Mm. Right. Right.
Right. So you're paying somewhere $4, $5 a pound, 6 for the majority of those coffees. Right. And it's starting at about, the upper $3 level, low $4 level that I'm paying. And then you're bringing it across the ocean to where you are. And by the time it arrives to you, it's $4.50, 420, something like that, right? With,
Mm.
some going higher. And the commodity stuff being more, in the upper $2, lower $3 range.
Right.
And that's the way it stays. Uh, and it did worry me because you become increasingly aware of the fact that there's less labor in Guatemala, and they're all going to the United States. And suddenly, you can't prune the shade trees, like you used to do to regulate the shade. And you just don't have the labor to do it. You don't have the labor to pick the cherries
Pick the
anymore.
coffee. Yeah.
You have big farms that, what quality did was farms went away from putting herbicide down and actually allowing the weeds to grow and then cutting them, right? These were big
Mhm.
farms doing this in Guatemala and such. More recently, some can't do that anymore. They can't afford it because they
Mhm.
don't have anybody. The weeds just take over and they don't know how to control it. And the labor to control the weeds is such that they go back to the herbicide, right?
Right.
So it's a backward motion now. And costs are going way up. And they were
Mhm.
going for many years for fertilizer and other things. And so now it's really accelerated. And I'm sure you brought this up. You've had this conversation with other people as well. I mean,
Well, and
so,
and this is the problem with it, right? Like, as
right.
you raise such an important point, as somebody who has been in operations for all of this time, you start to question, wait, what's happening here? If the price is staying where it is, but the cost to produce the coffee
Yeah.
is
Going up.
going up, the inputs are
That's
going up, we're headed for a brick wall. This doesn't
right.
go because the price is not going to get cheaper. We know that. We know for sure it's not going to get
Right.
cheaper
Not the, not,
because
not, price for the coffee grower is not going to go down. It's going to go
No.
up. Right.
And people keep asking me, how did you know that this crisis was coming? Because we have been talking about this moment since 2018. We didn't know when it was going to happen, and when it just happens to be 2025. But what George is just saying there, folks, that was when I knew if there's this disconnect between how the price is being priced and it's actually going down. The price went below $1 for a minute. And farmers were cutting down their trees, and there is no way out of this other than to hit a brick wall if we don't fix this problem. And there was no concerted effort from any of the so-called leaders of the industry and associations, et cetera, to start focusing on this problem.
Very hard to do individually because, again, especially now, specialty has grown to where there's more cafes of specialty coffee than you can count. And growing. And so, I can separate myself out and sell similar coffee quality at a higher price right next door to somebody who's selling a similar coffee at much lower, and now I'm in trouble. So it's very hard to...
100%.
You have to be...
100%.
Right. So once again, it's a survival mode. Right now, so my guess also is, though, that... quality, it's the lower parts. I was mentioning this to you before. I suspect that what you're going to see is the base is going to start getting eaten up like by an acid underneath with artificial coffee. That's going to start.
Right.
You got people
and
right
so
now,
we're going to see the emergence.
Yeah. So suddenly the lower priced people are going to be competing with non-coffee coffee.
Wild.
Right. I just see that. I mean, it's inevitable in this day and age.
Technology is playing such a bigger role in all of it as we move. We really have no idea.
That's right. Right. And the whole thing on this popular thing, I mean, the Instagrams and the TikToks and so on, and the fads that come on one right after another, the detours that take away our focus and our concentration are ever more rapid. And that's scary.
I want to ask you about matcha in a second, since you mentioned fads. But before I ask you about matcha, I used to actually, let me ask you now.
I'm watching that. We have much, it's like...
I wanted to ask you. I bet you're selling a lot of it, right?
Right. We're selling it, I mean, I am the guy who was supposedly invented a Frappuccino, so I can't complain.
Well, there's nothing supposedly about it. You and your team did invent it. You did sell it to Starbucks. So now I want to ask you something else. Given what happened in 75 and 76 with regards to the way that you approached increasing the prices, how will you and Jenny look at it now, given that you're about to start using the stock that you did pay an extraordinary price for? By the way, shout out to Jenny. But how will you guys approach having that conversation with your customers?
So essentially, one, I've kept them as in really informed, right?
Right.
I've sent out newsletters that really cover what has produced it, the fact that consumption has been larger than production for quite a few number of years. So that backstock has disappeared. You're really down to the nub, if you will, and so that plus climate change has created a real crisis, and on and on. But don't for a minute think that farmers are striking it rich for the most part, because costs have gone up as well. I mean, in a nutshell, that's sort of
right
where we've been going.
Right.
because we have done very well last year, really doing, and we had real breakthroughs in wholesale, which was interesting because I do have to say that I gave up on restaurants from the previous chapter that we were talking about.
Yeah.
They have to come on their bended knee to want to sell to them, because
Right.
I'm not spend a whole lot of money setting them up only to be told by their next manager that, oh, it's too expensive. Goodbye.
Right.
But I now have bakeries and more fast food, but higher quality, that are looking for higher quality. They're looking to distinguish. So we've increased a lot. So we don't have deep pockets, but we have deeper pockets than a lot of others might have.
What role do you think that the maturity of specialty... Sorry, go on.
Let me just say, that allows me to basically say, we're only increasing the price by what it went up to us. In other words, our margins are going with it. Right.
Okay.
So that's what we're doing, essentially.
With regards to the restaurants and the bakeries, the higher end bakeries coming to you, do you think that that's because, this is a little off topic, but sort of related, do you think that specialty coffee is reaching a maturity in the Boston area whereby restaurants and bakeries see the value proposition, whereby it's not just an afterthought?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. I recently read, but I haven't really looked into it, that a number of restaurants, this was a year ago, were actually letting go of the people doing the pastries and the desserts because of the cost.
What are they doing? Yeah.
Basic meal, but do more than that. I mean, because they have their own labor issues and costs and food, so on, happening as well. And then to do high quality requires a barista, not just the waiter or the waitress doing it, because that's what they all rely on. The waiter or waitress gets the coffee and pours it into the cups, and there it goes. Suddenly, that's one price. But now if you have somebody who's trained and who's going to stay there for years, making espresso, and they all have to have espresso because to look at that machine, it's so impressive. Yes. Wow. And cappuccino and all the rest of it, right? So they can't maintain it. They can't maintain the quality. Where do they go? They're going, and you see this in Europe, they're going to like Michelin star restaurants are now headed for those little capsules. Right.
Or they're having a barista come and brew you a V60 at the side of your table. Right? Yeah. This is all a part of the showmanship of the Michelin star restaurants.
At least in Boston, that didn't work.
Right.
A few people tried that, and their hearts were in the right place, but they gave up because it's too much. And that person standing there, the amount of time it takes to pour coffee and brew coffee at the table when other customers want their service and all the rest of it, that's a huge increase. So there's it's a real issue. The quickest way to me to solve that would be French press, actually.
Right.
French press, you can have an idiot do it. Here's your you always have the same container, so
no disrespect to any waiter that's listening to this.
Or put that in, you grind it, put it in, add hot water, put it on the table, say 4 minutes, and you got it. That's how coffee can, by the way, Coffee Connection, that's what we were doing back in the day, right? For coffee can. French press isn't my favorite way to drink anymore, but it might be very good for the evening because it's stronger that way, heavier bodied, and able to stand up to the dessert and all the food you've just had and the wine and everything.
Right.
So that might be a way for restaurants to not only serve better quality than what they are and fresher coffee, really fresh,
Mhm.
I would say they should freeze the whole bean coffee that they grind, which makes it better. And then, you got 4 people at a table and all 4 could order different coffees and
Yeah.
compare to each other.
Yeah. And then it becomes
it's-
an experience again.
Right. But standing there doing a drip coffee, you've got to be kidding. I
I
mean,
can't
yes,
wait for you to come to the Middle East.
$1,000 per person in a restaurant, sure.
Right. Right.
But Boston cafes, Boston restaurants are not at that level
No.
yet.
Quick,
There might
quick,
be
quick,
fewer.
quick, quick.
And it's
Right.
always going to be a drop in the bucket.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So in the next episode, folks, we're talking about regenerative agriculture and the role that it's going to play in coffee. Join us for
That's 20
yet
minutes.
another amazing. It's 25 minutes, sir. So join us for these conversations are going far too fast for my liking, to be honest. But join us in the next episode, folks. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. This episode is part of a 5-part series produced by Mapper Forward. Check the full playlist and guest details in the show notes, as well as how you can support our work in the coffee industry. Become a premium YouTube subscriber, explore our Patreon and any brands we've partnered with to bring you this podcast. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really does help us grow our audience.